Hey folks, just a quick shout out to our patrons before we get started. Thank you so much for supporting us. It really means a lot to me and the others here on the show. Okay, let's go. This is Acid Horizon, a theory podcast which confronts global crisis and the specter of a world that could be free. This is episode 10. Althusser's concept of ideology, a discussion with Anthony McGavin. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. In today's episode, we discuss Althusser's notion of ideology as it appears in the text on the reproduction of capitalism, ideology, and ideological state apparatuses. Joining us for the discussion is Anthony from the Out of Left Field podcast in Canada. Anthony suggested we cover the work in focus. Thanks for coming on today. And Anthony, maybe you can offer a little bit about yourself and your theoretical interests.
Absolutely. Yeah, correct. Thanks so much for having me on, you guys. So a little bit about myself. I am a doctoral student at the University of Victoria, or as we refer to it on our podcast, the Gulag Archipelago of Soviet Kanakistan. I'm not sure if that's a trademarked phrase. I might have to ask my producer, Ben, if I can use that on the show. So I study in the Cultural, Social, and Political Thought program as an individual interdisciplinary student. What that means is I'm kind of in between departments. My background comes from philosophy, but the trajectory of my studies in philosophy kind of led me into the theory side, which effectively made me a black sheep in a lot of the actual philosophy departments around, as they are still separated by the analytic continental divide, and the majority of them falling on the analytic side. Yes, it's still a pervasive problem. So I had to find a way to kind of shoehorn myself into what I still regarded as my disciplinary home in some respect, while still getting into this interdisciplinary program. And that's where I'm at now. I am technically located in the French and philosophy departments. There I am working still on problems in the philosophy of science, but incorporating more theoretical methods from the interdisciplinary humanities, post-humanities, such as deconstruction, new materialism, and speculative realism. And I'm looking at, as my problem area, emerging gene editing technologies and other biotechnologies. And what I'm really interested in, and how Althusser can kind of be looked at in relation to some of these problems. And I should back up and say he's not really been so much part of my theoretical work since a few years back at the start of my master's, and has really been part of, I think, what has made me a bit sympathetic to these black sheep in philosophy department feelings. We can talk about that, but also more related to my my political work on the side. But I digress. The way that he talks about ideological formations and how these exert a kind of action on the material bases from which they manifest, and the way that he explains the emergence of structures and patternings as a kind of relatively independent force, I think is very helpful for thinking about the way that the kinds of research subcultures and popular subcultures that emerge around new gene editing biotech, circles like biopunk, DIY biohackers, grinder spaces. They're quite numerous in pushing the envelope in the experimentation that's being done. And I'm looking at the way that these ideological formations interact with the microcellular formations from the subculture to the microcellular palette, basically, could be the slogan for my research. Yeah, so that's a brief synopsis.
To be honest, I didn't expect that, so it seems we're going to be on an interesting trajectory today. Also, I should mention, this is the second time Adam has appeared on the show. He initially joined us for our interview with Ben Noyes, and we'll be hearing more from him in this and future episodes. Adam works on Hegel and Stirner, if that wasn't made apparent in our previous show. Is there anything I'm leaving out, Adam?
Well, A formal introduction. Hello, everyone. I am the token Hegelian here to bring representing the old negation gang. So my PhD is based at the Centre for Research in Modern European Philosophy over in Kingston in London, and it's Hegel and Stirner. My main interest in Hegel is a certain kind of reading that came out of France in the sort of late 90s from Gavin and Malabou. It's called a plastic reading of Hegel. It tries to read Hegel as producing a kind of subjectivity which is incredibly malleable, open to change, quite destructive in some ways, but generally something that is able to quite play and adapt to form and formation. And I think that ends up in Stirner, as evil and as radical and as nihilistic as it comes. I think there's a lot that Hegel's thought, especially read through Malabou's work, it can learn from Stirner. And I'm trying to build together what let's call an insurrectionary Hegelianism, which I think maybe in the future I might try and see, given how much Stirner is used as evidence against Hegel by Deleuze and others, that maybe actually this Hegel and this Deleuze fellow, maybe they're not too bad, they're not too separate. Maybe we can have sort of, a unique without essences and a body of our organs at the same time. It's heresy, but I'm looking forward to working.
And your music might again be at the end of the episode, so we'll check on that later.
Yes, I do Hegelian accelerationist harsh noise. Check it out.
That's really interesting, Adam. I haven't read much Stirner, but I'm really interested in Malabou's take on Hegel.
And although Matt couldn't be with us today, we also have Will here. So let's get right into the chapters in focus today. We are looking specifically at Althusser's recasting of Marx's notion of base and superstructure and ideology in general. And we are also going to look at what Althusser says specifically about the state, the law, and the general theory, as I mentioned. Anthony, since this was your choice of text, maybe you can make some opening comments about why you chose this reading once again, and why do you find it important, theoretically speaking, and maybe we can also get at why Althusser's formulation is deemed a structuralist one.
Absolutely. So, as I was alluding to in my kind of introductory comments, I came into this text in a number of different ways and on a number of different occasions. And really, I came to it first politically more so than philosophically. So, although it was part of my trying to bridge kind of analytic epistemologies of science to what Althusser was saying about the reproduction of the social relations of production under capitalism and the kinds of structures of belief that go with that, when I came to it, I was also kind of on the fringes feeling dejected from this big Trotskyite group as the kind of lone philosopher around a bunch of people who were eager to talk about theory, but not really, to do philosophy as metaphysics. And I found this very stifling. And so Althusser was personally, in terms of my historical relationship to the text, quite a comfort to start reading and engaging seriously that way. And then more and more as I revisited Althusser's writings over the years that followed, because this story I just told, it comes kind of late in the game. I only started reading Althusser maybe around 2013, 2014, after a late conversion to Marxism from a disenchanted or anarchistic youth. Don't ask me to peg my ideological alliance now. I'm not sure exactly what words or isms to use. I just started reading more into Althusser's autobiography, for instance, the kinds of tragic details of his mental illness, the killing of his wife, and the very interesting matter of perspective in that writing that he's doing, because it's also a kind of post-traumatic moment that Althusser is endeavoring to theorize. And then even again, revisiting these texts before our meeting today, thinking about, I was kind of reading the sections from On Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses that we discussed, along with some of Althusser's later writings on the materialism and the encounter, given that you suggested we try to perhaps bind or see where the points of contact are between this theory of ideology and, across the gap of negativity on the positive side, something like how Deleuze is explaining things. So, there are multiple paths that are kind of open up, and I find it's a very fraught history with many obstacles in the way, but it's always made it all the richer. So, philosophy, politics, I think that Althusser is imperative today to read.
I think one of the first things to get at are the concepts at work in Althusser. I mean, right in the title, the third word, reproduction. And I'm kind of stealing this question from Will, but
I honestly do not care.
Well, you will when I start stealing more. But anyway, the important question, I think, is what does Althusser mean by the reproduction of capitalism?
Yeah, so the reproduction of capitalism is it's part of Althusser's thesis on ideology. One of the important related concepts here is his distinction between, or his development of Marx's distinction of the superstructure and the economic infrastructure or base of society. Althusser is going to, as he sees it, add to that the underlying logic in Marx's articulation by explaining that the superstructure is actually going to ultimately play a role in determining the kinds of continuities in the political and economic formation of the economic infrastructure. And so he says that ideology, the kind of basic definition, is the social reproduction of the relations of production. And he starts off by giving a kind of very traditionally materialist, as Althusser would explain it, view of reproduction through the cycle of commodities. You have somebody who is producing yarn, which is the condition for the reproduction of another economic unit using the yarn to make clothing, and then so on up the chain until you have service workers selling you clothes at the Gap or what have you. And Althusser wants to explain that this is also happening at the level of ideas in very subtle ways all the way down the chain. Not only ideas, he will explain that the superstructure is itself split between politico-legal formations and ideological formations. And so there is the executive arm of the superstructure, so to speak. I'm not sure that Althusser would exactly parse it that way, but I find it's a nice way to put a thesis that he advances on the relative autonomy of the superstructure. And the ideological formations are instilled from anything down to the family, the church. Education is a big one for him. And also one that piggybacks on the historical context of Althusser's writing and the position that he occupied at the university. So those are kind of, I guess, some of the nuts and bolts of the reproduction of the relations of production thesis of ideology he's advancing.
So in what ways do you think, because I'm a little lost when it comes to Althusser sometimes, in what ways is this different from kind of conventional Marxist formulations of reification?
In terms of the traditional Marxist definitions of reification, it's an interesting question. And I think that Althusser perhaps gives different answers at different points in his career. He, in a very real sense, sees a concrete path out of ideology. And one of the important contexts that we should perhaps introduce in terms of talking about this work is the historical debate that he was interjecting in between Marxist humanism and, what he would call the anti-humanist line or the structuralist line of thinking. And so the idea that structural relations in society ultimately kind of give rise to subjectivity, and I think he sees it as kind of undercutting, but also providing a possible way out, granted that you can develop a rigorously scientific analysis of the mechanisms that play in producing concrete forms of consciousness and producing forms of subjectivity. So to give you an example, I mean, he sees Marx as doing this, and it is key to Althusser's project to try and situate him, to put himself in the boots of Marx at the moment that he is discovering the scientific logic of capital. And he perceives there being a kind of epistemic or scientific break between the moment that Marx is writing the 1844 economic and philosophic manuscripts, between then and even after the German ideology to the time that he's writing Capital in 1867. And I can't remember the exact date of the German ideology. But he sees Marx himself drop the concepts of alienation, of subject, of these categories, humanist categories that we kind of ascribe to the reification thesis, and sees Marx as now inhabiting the kind of plateau, you could even say, of the bourgeois economic worldview. He explains this as a time that Marx started to seriously engage with the works of Ricardo and Adam Smith, and in places, I mean, these are also the places where Althusser makes those occasional drops to Spinoza, say, and explains that Marx is now inhabiting a new totality, which is this new world, and it's a kind of phenomenal encounter. So in that ways, I mean, I think it does kind of converge with maybe some ways that the reification thesis would later be developed, or ways that Althusser wasn't conscious of at the time. But I think it has a different orientation.
Yeah, there's a few terms in the base and superstructure chapter of the book that I think we need to unpack, or at least introduce into the discussion. And also, you already mentioned one of the two notes that Althusser adds to this theory of base and superstructure that we don't see in Marx that I can remember. Maybe you can correct me on this. Althusser says that the superstructure, as you said, is relatively autonomous with respect to the base. And then he also says that the superstructure reacts back on the base. Now, if somebody's coming to these terms for the first time, how would you explain what it means for the superstructure to react back on the base?
The sense in which it reacts back on the base, you can think of it in this way. This would be my kind of Friday night reading group example. If you are in the workplace, and from the point of view of just pure productive efficiency, it may be in the interest of the employer to, have all the workers kind of united and, have a neat little social totality. But we know that what is more often the case is that employers like to exploit small differences to keep their employees divided, either by obfuscating some of the economic knowledge of their position, structure knowledge of the position. For instance, if you're not unionized, not knowing how much every other worker is making, this is one of the primary obfuscations of bourgeois ideology, thinks Althusser, and how it emerges, we can talk about later, as a kind of absent cause of our imaginary social relations under capitalism, but also much more deeply entrenched kind of ideological rifts in society that cut through and divide the working class along the lines of race, gender, any kind of visible difference. So I think that Althusser sees a disparity there, where ideology is finding more effective and insistent ways, the superstructure, more effective and insistent ways to continue to reproduce capitalist social relations. And what I don't necessarily find here, although it's perhaps implicit in how strongly Althusser presents himself as adhering to Marx, is that there's a sense of degeneracy of capitalist relations, and to explain economically the why, for why it may be necessary to hinder its productivity in order to maintain that particular mode of production. But that would be to push the speculation a little bit.
I think it's also quite a crude sort of physical way in which he talks about reaction that I think is tied quite clearly to his idea of the topological structure of base and superstructure. It's kind of like a Jenga tower, or most famously a poster of capital at the top, the king, the priest, everyone shooting down upon the other, and then you get to the top, it's relatively autonomous. The king can move about when he wants. There's no one above him. Well, capital can do it once, there's no one above them, but there is this pushing down. Because production is what builds up the structure. Reproduction is this reaction. It's the pushing down of ideology upon the consciences or the consciousness of concrete individuals, such that they are called to be subjects, and they are, as Althusser says, it makes them go. This pressure from above pushes them down into motion.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that the making them tick introduces kind of positive part that was missing from my description too, because he talks a lot about how part of this reciprocal action is the creation of know-how, a general know-how and competencies. So, my example served to illustrate one point, descriptive of where we're at in terms of capitalist productivity. But, it also serves to make it tick and to accelerate production.
I think there's two other terms that we need to get a handle on, because you see this all over the book. Determination in the last instance, and then the index of effectivity.
So the determination in the last instance is an interesting one. And I think that perhaps the best way to understand it is through the way in which Althusser does see himself as inhabiting that moment where Marx sits into an entirely new and scientific worldview, because he does not present himself as a kind of a vulgar economic kind of reductivist, but does adhere to the thesis that economic relations and the mode of production do primarily determine the shapes, limit the field of possibilities in which for superstructural relations to take shape. So you could think of it as a comment on the necessity and contingency of certain historical forms. Althusser isn't going to want to say that particular superstructural forms are, strictly speaking, necessary correlates to the social formations and modes of production that give rise to them, but they do limit the scope of contingencies in terms of the potential shapes that they may take.
One of the things that really stood out to me in the base and superstructure chapter is the methodology that he undertakes, not only to discuss the division between base and superstructure itself, but then there's the substrata of the superstructure, the division of floors in the spatial metaphor, as he says. And one of the things that stands out to me there too is basically he says it comes down to these 3 to 4 basic categories, which include the state, law, and ideology as various forms of superstructural entities. In one of his formulations, he talks about the legal politico with the hyphen in the middle. And he even says that we have to explain this hyphen too. Like, what is it that's happening at the intersection of these various ideologies? Maybe you could talk a little bit about just his methodology there and what he's trying to get at by making these distinctions.
Sure. So Althusser is quite conscious that he is advancing a material thesis, but in a new way. And so I think that the hyphen you point to in the politico-legal points to that line that he is trying to walk, that rather fine line that he is trying to walk. And so you see it coming up later, for instance, in his explanation that ideology has a material existence and exists in concrete practices and rituals, as well as in the interpolation thesis, which I'm sure we'll spend quite a lot of time discussing. But, the experience of having the cop shout, "Hey, you there!" and immediately you know yourself to always already have been the subject to which that hail is directed.
Right.
These are ways in which he's trying to present the ideological formations all the way up the chain to the kinds of discursive formations and textual formations that supervene on them, trying to exhibit that those have a material existence all the way down that, at a certain level we can even feel to be viscerally embodied. But that these things are not ultimately separate. And this also speaks to your former question about the indexes of efficacy. I think the index of efficacy, which I'm not sure, it felt a little bit like an underdetermined concept that I was trying to piece together as I continued to move through the text. But it seems something like the efficiency with which these chains operate through one another.
I kind of want to relate the work that I'm seeing here to the work of Deleuze and Guattari, which I've worked quite a bit with. I mean, this particular work by Althusser came out shortly after the events of May 68, right? And arguably, the writing of Anti-Oedipus is a reaction to that in part as well. And what seems interesting to me is when we talk about being hailed, for example, as a function of ideology, immediately I'm asking myself, okay, what is the place of desire in this, the way that Deleuze and Guattari formulate it? Maybe we can push Althusser. How is it that somebody comes to be subjectified in such a way that they do respond to that call from the police officer, or when their phone rings in the morning and it's their boss, they immediately leap into that mode of subordination? How do those forces play out in Althusser's view?
If I could bring something back to reproduction just while you're thinking about that, if we were to link these strands of subjectification, reification, anti-humanism, and reproduction all together, is that the anti-humanism from this seems to stem from the idea that the subject itself is a reification, and it is the mode of reproduction. And I think there's also something else you say about reproduction in terms of he's doing an investigation, he's trying to do science. And what he's doing is, to do this science, is he's trying to take it, he's trying to not go from the field of production, which is arguably more traditional political economy, but from, as he calls it, the point of view of reproduction, which is, in a sense, a bit problematic if you're trying to put Deleuze and Guattari into it, because the point of view of reproduction is the point of view, to an extent, of capital's representation to itself. And I think this point of view is also tied quite well to the notion of science here, at least in terms of how this notion of scientific presentation has been taken up from Hegel and from Marx, in the idea that first we take, in Hegel's phenomenology, for example, consciousness does not come to the point of calling itself a subject or being called to realize itself as a subject until it gets to self-consciousness, until it gets to the representation of the object to itself. The point of view of production, there's no subject there. It's only when you get to reproduction that in order to reproduce the objects that you're relating to in your social life, that it points back to you and says, oh, no, this is me, this is a subject, I'm doing this. So I think the point of doing a scientific reproduction of ideology, of the conditions of capital, is also to raise us to a point of self-consciousness of ideology. And that's the point where Althusser says we can actually say, if we're a Marxist, I am in ideology, and therefore I can talk about the mechanisms of how my own subjectification works, and then possibly reconstruct them towards emancipatory ends.
I think that's exactly right. That gets to the heart of the issue. And Adam, while you were speaking, it made me think of another paragraph from later on in the work that we're looking at in Ideology and the State, where there's this really interesting comment Althusser makes. He says, this amounts to saying that ideology has no outside for itself, but at the same time that it is nothing but outside for science and reality. And so he's commenting here, he says that one of the first effects of ideology is the practical denegation of its ideological character. And so the way that he's advancing this kind of scientific approach to countering the effects of this denegation, or at least finding a way out of it through the kind of reconstruction. He draws a lot of comparisons between himself and Lacan, not directly, but saying that Althusser's relation to Marx is akin to Lacan's relation taken up to Freud. And, I think that that's quite telling of the kind of relation that Althusser is trying to get at here. The science is what is rigorously determined by the base. The emancipatory science is rigorously determined by the base, as well as subjectivity itself within this formation that we necessarily inhabit.
I think you're very right to bring it back to the point of denegation, because what does ideology do? It takes contradiction out of subjectivity. It doesn't show you that you're a worker and this person's rich. It doesn't point these things as contradictory. Neither does it do what the Lacanian subject would do, and inscribe them an internal contradiction. And then even in their own social relationships, we don't see contradiction. We only see the most generic, blunt points of difference.
Oh, I mean, I was just gonna. I think the denegation operation is foundational, to the point that it also denegates the further possibilities of the subject and its ability to kind of conceive itself in an outside, in another world.
We came into this discussion wanting to talk about not only ideology, but the state, and then also law he brings up. How does Althusser connect these different concepts? Are these reified concepts for him, the state, the law, and ideology in general? And if they are, or even if they aren't, how do they connect?
I don't think that the state is a reified concept for Althusser. He does take the Marxist and Lenin's theory seriously, that the state exists as a repressive although he'll say it's a repressive apparatus. So it exists in its practices and formations, so that there is a bit of a separation between the state as a reified abstraction and the state as a set of apparatuses that function to execute state power. So he's trying to create that theoretical divide, and comment that state power and state apparatus must be separated if the proletariat is going to be able to seize state power and destroy the existing bourgeois state apparatuses. And so, I'm sorry, what was the so the state is one of these superstructural formations, and he explains how repressive apparatuses in general are themselves split into the different categories of ideological state apparatuses and repressive state apparatuses. And this is part of how state power is complexifying and directing itself. And you can see similarities with Foucault's thesis on power as well, who's a contemporary or a student of Althusser's. And I want to be clear that I think Althusser also maintains that theoretical practical distinction quite consciously in his distinction between ideological and repressive state apparatuses. He does give some examples and comments that the key difference is that repressive state apparatuses like the police, like carceral institutions, prisons, which, very excited to talk to you, Craig, on our podcast this coming week about that. These are examples of repressive state apparatuses because they function primarily by violence, and ideological state apparatuses, by comparison, function primarily by ideology and are inclusive of the church, family, education, institutions. But he also mentions that this is, to a certain extent, just an analytic distinction, and that in the actual institutions, you will always find the means of violence and ideological means being kind of blended. So you actually do get something like what Foucault will call disciplinarity in educational institutions. And I think you can even see the germs of that in Althusser's explanation of the direction of state power and dissemination of state power.
So when I first got to know you, you let me know that you were a tutor in a prison, and I'm an educator in prison as well. Well, we've seen the inside of an incarcerated space, and both of these apparatuses are at work, the repressive apparatus and the ideological apparatus. On Althusser's terms, how do those concepts work together, given that the prison is like a microcosm of society in stark relief?
Yeah, so I can give a kind of interesting example that blends some of these, and I think helps bring them out, because I was working in the prison as a volunteer tutor at the school there, doing kind of K-12, a lot of high school equivalency examinations. So according to Althusser's definition, I am there as part of the ideological state apparatus, an extension of it. But then I'm also kind of an insurgent in this role, trying to, obviously I can't bring the Communist Manifesto into the prison, but if there's a copy of Rousseau sitting on the shelf or some interesting article in the news comes up, those things are worthy of being mentioned. But, what occurred to me working inside of a prison like this, it was a maximum security prison here on the island, was that in addition to the strict regimentation of time and space and the enforceability of rules of obedience and expected moral character, there was the interruption of time and space. And this first occurred to me as I was there working as a tutor with the head tutor. There were these constant interruptions, and it seemed like the administrative staff could never get the schedule right. Certain blocks would just randomly miss their classes certain weeks or for multiple weeks at a time because, there was a blunder in scheduling and it was going to take some time to fix. And I asked the head tutor there, why does this keep on happening? Surely somebody can figure out something as simple as a schedule system, which is on the face of it complicated, as the administrative staff would tell you, because a lot of the inmates themselves are constantly being circulated through different cell blocks. And so this is another example, mind you, of the kind of structure of interruption, which I think does resemble the thesis of interpolation, how Althusser describes it. And he simply told me, you are approaching the problem as if this is broken. This is not meant to be how this institution works, but it is actually meant to work this way.
I have the exact same experience as you. I mean, just numerous lockdowns. I think I've talked about this in one of our first episodes, and we'll probably get into this big time tomorrow. And this is once again where I connect Deleuze and Guattari to the prison, and maybe we can even bring in some Althusser here. The system functions by breaking down. And I think in a case where you have such a concentration of juridical power and ideological power in one space, that breakdown just becomes more apparent. In seeing these breakdowns, it became obvious to me that at some level, on a systemic level, they're intentional, right? Or at least that they're programmatic, incorporated into the program. And part of us being tutors or teachers inside the prison system, we too are subjects of that system in as much as we're agents of the system, and that irregularity operates on us as well, so that we don't get a certain kind of foothold over the power that's dominant in that system.
Yeah, it's absolutely correct. And I don't know exactly what your experience was, Craig, but in my case, the school, it almost had a relative autonomy, very constrained, mind you, in that we could give inmates pencils or other small supplies. Like the head tutor there assumed responsibility for basically just distributing needed school supplies. But of course, this had to be very kind of contained and controlled, and a lot of guards either turned a blind eye or intervened as necessary for totally needless purposes. Like, okay, Frank had too many pencils this week, and now he won't have pencils for 6 weeks, can't do his homework outside of to the school itself. And so, yeah, we are partially subject to that in, I think, conscious and unconscious ways, in terms of the ways that we can approach certain conversations, the things that we can talk about, the information that we can relay.
Well, maybe tomorrow when I come on your podcast, we can really go in depth on that. And trade war stories, as it were. But before we get back into the text, I think Will has a question.
Yeah, I guess I do have a question about the separation between the legal and the political. Both of you guys are invoking Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault. To bring it back onto Althusser, there's a fundamental distinction between those two entities, right? Like there's an operational separation where the one informs the other in Althusser, but they're not intermingled, right? The interpolation relationship is not one of like a meshing between the cultural and the legal, right? The formalism of law. It's sort of an interaction of two separate structures. So, while I think I get the invocation of figures like D&G and Foucault, I do think that there's probably a separation in my reading, and I just want to know, like, what is that? What are the functional differences for Althusser?
One of the fundamental things which maybe we haven't raised yet, and which actually goes back to the point about what distinguishes Althusser's theory on ideology from a reification thesis, and it's one of the closer points of contact here, is that ideology's ability to interpolate subjects functions vis-a-vis recognition, and more often the case, misrecognition. But it's that kind of mechanism, which is the operation of negativity functioning in this relation of interpolation. So Althusser kind of hedges around the nature of the relation between these two things. He does comment, I think in a footnote somewhere, that the law, capital L, belongs to both the repressive state apparatus and to the system of ideological state apparatuses. But where I am bringing the function of recognition and misrecognition into this and saying that kind of crosses both, I think Althusser wants to say that it depends in each particular case, the nature of the relationship between the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatus. Because one example he gives towards the end of the text is the example of God and subjection to God's commandments, and even the rituals and practices of mortification of the flesh, setting up a kind of punitive and disciplinary structure and relation to the law, to what he will actually qualify in later writings as the logos, coming very close to Derrida. and Heidegger, but he doesn't set it up exactly in the kind of Foucaultian terms that I just imposed, mind you. But I think that it speaks to the theme that kind of maybe emerged in some of our earlier discussion, which was that it is the power or the efficacy through which power can operate down the chains that link ideological state apparatuses, the system or matrix of ideological state apparatuses, to the instruments and vehicles of repressive state power, that in each case determine how the function of recognition is playing out, or misplaying in the case of misrecognition, if that makes sense. So a lot of times, to briefly remark on the experience with inmates in the prison again before bracketing it all for tomorrow, these individuals are a lot more conscious of the misrecognition with the way in which the deal that they've been given by penal institutions. And in a way that the Christian engaged in rituals of mortification and the sanctification of the flesh is not. It's a different kind of, or a different. The relation has a different quality or character, but structurally it is performing the same function.
Yeah, there's an ideological interplay that must presuppose any sort of conference of authority, I guess. On these institutions. Okay, I think that's a pretty structural argument that does distinguish itself a little bit from later Foucault, and obviously from Deleuze and Guattari. So yeah, I think that's a good answer.
I mean, if I could come in on Anthony, you mentioned Althusser's use of the term the logos to talk about ideology and interpolation, and if I can go on to a bit of a quasi-Derridian sort of rambling on the term logos, it doesn't just mean the word, but also it means account, and it doesn't mean it's the word that summons you to be a subject. It's also an account of you, telling you what you are, what your identity is, saying it's totally substantial, there's no contradiction, and you can be held accountable for it. And this also ties into how ideology, in terms of the law, has what Althusser calls a moral supplement in the form of various other ideologies. Because every time you're interpolated by religious ideology, by moral ideology, even by just standard ideology of the duty to be a good worker, a different account of you is presented at each point. And it is also another way in which you can violate the law, in which you be held accountable to it. So the supplement is it's a series of accounts of you, ways you can be held accountable, and ways you can be held accountable to not doing your job as a decent capitalist, or a decent Christian, or a decent worker, or a decent whatever. Absolutely.
And to introduce the spinozistic side to your Derridian supplement, I think that the logos is foundational in creating an ethics, in whatever kind of ideological sphere you happen to inhabit, to encounter, to be interpolated by, really, at this stage in Althusser. I should qualify that, when I'm drawing Althusser's reflections on the logos, these are actually from his earlier work. These are actually from his later works on the materialism and the encounter, where I think that he really kind of ramps up the contingency and starts to maybe show some of his convergences with the trajectories of Deleuze and Guattari. But I'll bracket that at this stage of the conversation.
So maybe during the final leg of our podcast here today, we can talk about Althusser's notion of ideology in general. And in chapter 12 of the book, it just starts out with, what is ideology? To begin with, why this term? And so I have a bundle of questions that you can respond to, all of them or just some of them. Why does Althusser pick up this term ideology, which arguably I think was abandoned by Marx after he wrote the German ideology? It wasn't a concept he really came back to. And then here we have not only Althusser exploring the fullest implications of this term, but then developing his own concept of an ideology of ideology.
I think he sees it, and I think you see it correctly, as an abandoned term in Marx. But that abandonment has some significance, and so far as Althusser sees himself as trying to pick up and inhabit Marx's philosophy before the moment of this epistemic break, the scientific break, the moment of the discovery of capital. And so he sees it as important to kind of advance that thesis and to fully flesh out its logic, so to speak. And so he comments that for Marx, the status of ideology was akin to the status of the dream image before Freud, which I think is one of the most telling and succinct kind of descriptions that he gives you, right? because ideology is something that actually has interpretive depth and that, as we discussed earlier, acts on or reacts to, more properly speaking, the economic base of society, the economic formation, the mode of production. And so now Althusser is going to distinguish between ideologies, plural, particular ideological formations, and ideology in general. He comments, again, something borrowed from Freud, one of his first, is this his... No, it's not in one of his theses. I forget he numbers a couple theses here. Scrap that. He comments that ideology in general has no history, whereas particular ideologies may have a history. You may be able to point to the conditions that made their emergence necessary retroactively. But ideology in general is eternal as a structuring factor of the imaginary, of our relations to each other, our real relations to each other as represented by the symbolic field. And so in some ways, this is not only an encounter with Freud, it is also a story of Althusser's close friendship with Claude Lévi-Strauss. And the idea that these symbolic formations could go all the way down into a search for anthropological origins. I think that he has a footnote somewhere commenting on Lévi-Strauss's idea of the dream image in Freud, and even the position that Freud picks up theoretically as being a later formation or a later kind of development of shamanic rituals in earlier social formations in human society. So it's I'm not going to comment on the veracity of that thesis at all, but it's telling for, I think, how Althusser is positioning himself here in respect of ideology in general. So he comments that ideology in general has no history, and that ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. That's thesis 1. And thesis 2 he gives on ideology in general is that it has a material existence. And there, I think he wants you to read that as the same gesture or similar gesture to what Lacan is making in his reading of Freud. He says elsewhere that, Lacan's first sentence is, Freud made a scientific discovery. And so he wants to pick up these scraps of Marx as a necessary prelude to that scientific discovery and something that merits fuller fleshing out, again, in response to the particular historical moment that he was involved in.
This is something that I haven't worked on as extensively as other things in the Marxist tradition. So there's still a lot of questions that I have about it. I really enjoyed the connection between ideology and Freud's notion of the unconscious. Now, would you say that, from a structural standpoint, or at least a diagrammatic standpoint, the ideology of ideologies, that first ideology that I'm talking about there, this is what has no outside. This is what allows, basically, to use like the Kantian language, like the conditions for the possibility for any sort of imaginary interaction between any human being. Would that be correct?
Yes, this is how we should parse the ideology has no outside, but is nothing but outside thesis that he throws out a little bit earlier in our conversation. Ideology in general has no outside. Ideologies in particular have that relative outside, but to parse it in Freudian terms, it is kind of the relative limit of between the conscious and the unconscious. And so you can't escape ideology tout court. You can sway from it, is a term he'll later use. You can sway or diverge or take hold of it or crystallize it in a new formation, but you can't smash the entire thing to the ground.
What then accounts for the swaying or the rupture of particulars from one to another in his terms?
This is really interesting, and something maybe we've been hedging around a bit in the conversation, which, Althusser, after the late 70s and early 80s, he takes quite a different direction in his philosophy. This was the result of a severe psychotic break, an intense period of hospitalization, and the killing of his wife, Helen Rittman, who was a sociologist and street fighter. But it was a period where he starts radically rethinking his relations to his earlier philosophies and introduces this language of the encounter and sway and divergence. And one of his main reference here, again, going back to Marx's even earlier philosophical education and interests, goes down to Epicurus and the atomist's worldview and the idea of the clinomen. So the kind of shifting in the void by which the random movements of atoms can actually be forced to encounter and create necessity out of contingency in those encounters. And so, he makes some comment on Epicurus, just remarking on the audacity of a philosopher who takes the sway as the origin, as more originary than the origin. And as he's explaining this atomic worldview of the encounter or sway, he has this beautiful passage just talking about the falling of rain, and compares the falling of rain to all of the accidents and incidents in Spinoza's One, and draws a number of other examples, to the way that Heidegger speaks of presence. It seems like a very disjointed philosophical lineage that he is drawing into the materialism of the encounter, including not only Spinoza and Heidegger, but also Machiavelli and Rousseau. And he does, in these later works, actually append Derrida's name to that list. And so it's kind of been in the background of some of our conversation, I think, because as much as Althusser is a structuralist, much like Lacan, he is already moving in a post-structuralist direction. And I think that only fully comes out after this period of intense mental health crisis and the psychotic break that he suffered. And interestingly, despite all of his kind of dalliances with Lacan earlier on, as he is a more kind of ardent structuralist in his theorizing, he had a non-Lacanian psychoanalyst and psychotherapist during this period of intense hospitalization, and even in his autobiography comments that he felt patronized by their teaching Lacan to him. So I don't know, maybe that puts like a nice cap on our earlier discussion too about teaching in a prison.
One of the things that you mentioned that I'm really glad that you brought into the discussion was the talk of the clinomen and Epicurus, because maybe not a lot of people know this, but Marx wrote his dissertation on Epicurus and the clinomen, as the clinomen being a sort of conceptual addition to atomism, the atomism of Democritus. And it's interesting how Althusser takes that up as part of his project. At least it seems to me might be functioning in the background of the work here.
I think it's absolutely correct. Yeah, it's beautiful too, because there's one passage I picked up on in the book, The Materialism of the Encounter, the Philosophy of the Encounter, where he briefly remarks that, maybe it was Lucretius and maybe it was Epicurus who came up with this idea of the clinomen. Regardless, if it doesn't appear in the fragments of Epicurus, then Lucretius discovered it as a necessary completion of his logic. And that just also, rhetorically, it perfectly captures how Althusser sees himself in respect of Marx and how he perceives Lacan in respect of Freud.
One last term that we will go into before I hand it over to Adam. He's going to ask, he has a little discussion of Christianity that we're going to talk about that appears in chapter 12 here. But what does Althusser mean by interpolation? This is a word that gets thrown around a lot. Some people use it quite casually after hearing it or reading Althusser once or twice. How is this different, for example, from subjectification in Foucault, for example?
Well, it's interesting because in some ways you can see how Foucault is inspired by it, if departing from it somewhat. Because my initial reaction is that for Althusser, it is much more a bodily effect of power that is inscribed in material and structural relations. And so, Foucault will talk about bodies as being constituted by power. Although, I don't know, I found at times reading Foucault, and maybe this is a sign of my post-humanist proclivities, but when he uses bodies, it tends to seem like sit in a place of abstraction for me, oftentimes. And of course, later people doing things with Foucault's work have done a great job of filling out that abstraction. But I think for Althusser, because he is writing for a particular class perspective, he is able to direct that argument quite forcefully and specifically. When he puts with exclamation marks in the text, "Hey, you there!" It's almost, it is both in terms of form and content in the text. That is the mark of interpolation, because it's almost like he is shouting at you in the second person, which he in fact is, and you can feel that in your bodies. So Althusser explains that interpolation is how ideology acts or functions, and it is the function of hailing or recruiting us to its processes, to its internal dynamics. And that is the way in which we are subjectified. So it's almost as if it has to first take hold in the body. It's, again, very telling that the example that he gives initially is of a cop shouting, "Hey, you there," at somebody on the street. But again, all the way up the chain in the system of ideological state apparatuses, it will continue to take hold of bodies in different ways. And maybe there it's a little bit murkier to track the distinction from Foucault. Therein, of course, the difference would be that Foucault doesn't see these things as an effective state power directly and specifically in the way that Althusser does.
Yeah, it would be the difference between the role that the ISA plays, right? With Foucault, there's going to be kind of a deep skepticism of laying it all on the ISA. But with Althusser, he would respond and kind of bite back and say that, in fact, like, we're naive if we don't find the final answer there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if I wanted to bring back, and you were talking about the encoding, I've already given it away, encoding of ideology on the body, it's, to go back to the Logos, which will ties nicely in with Christianity. Yeah, that materiality encodes the body in terms of the literal means in which it can conduct itself, insofar as its conscience is determined by ideology that tells it what it can and can't do. And I think maybe have an opening to this Delusionghattarian strain of coding that we can get into, in further discussions on Deleuze and Guattari, because the very presupposition of any kind of coding on the body or organization of the body is that there must be this well of potentiality that could be encoded upon. Any organization of any body presupposes the possibility and the virtuality of its being deorganized. But to carry on to Christianity, you can give an example of this in the Catholic tradition, in which you can even treat the wafer as a kind of code, because you had taken encounter with what Althusser calls the absolute subject, this centering subject upon whom everything revolves around, like the Empyrean in Dante's Paradiso. And I think this absolute subject is possibly the example of ideology par excellence in terms of how it deviates from what we can say is more contemporary readings of Christianity in this kind of Althusserian ideological critical tradition, people like Zizek and people like McGowan, because the absolute subject of Christianity here is a being totally without contradiction, totally substantial, and he can guarantee your own substantiality and account for you if you're accountable to him. The God of Christianity here is being completely without contradiction, which is kind of weird when you consider that a God so unfree of contradiction that become free people at once and then die on the cross in the most humiliating possible event of negation in history of human mythology. So I think, this comes back to the idea of fully substantiating the bodies, encoding substance on the bodies of the subject. It gives you an account that you're actually all right, you're recognized as having this identity of substantiality, and then it throws upon you this coding, which means that you're accountable for it. It inscribes sin upon the body in the means of the code. And I think maybe one of the best things about the Zizekian revival of Hegelian Christianity is that, this contradiction is inherent to the very notion of God itself. And then in Zizek's reading, which is honestly just beautiful, you should check it out in The Fragile Absolute and the Monstrosity of Christ, is that the death of God sort of shows that actually contradictions internal to being itself, and this is dispersed amongst all this subjects in the holy community of the Holy Spirit. So we're all contradictory, none of us substantial. We're still accountable to an extent that we have ethics, But this contradiction is allowed to be played with, to be malleable, to be quite plastic. And that's where the fracture of a self-reflective version of ideology can possibly bring a scientific break.
And it seems like the taking of Holy Communion is kind of a paradigmatic example of that. It's the literal ingestion of a contradiction, like you're saying, and it has an element of beliefs, but there's also a kind of semiotic transmission that's like an order word there. It's not that we're necessarily being inculcated with a belief on the spot. A certain kind of belief is being rehearsed, but there's a practice, a ritual, a redundancy there that continually inscribes and effectuates an incorporeal transformation of the person taking Holy Communion, which is body of Christ, amen, and yet you are still insufficient to be as that which you've consumed.
It's not just the transubstantiation of the bread into the body of Christ. In a sense, by taking it in, you admit you are held accountable. You are given the account of Christ, the logos within you, and become part of that substance, which is seen as totally non-contradictory, pure, and is coming to get you.
Absolutely, because you're inscribed into a system of concrete contradictions, right? And I think that the origins of Christianity definitely points to that.
That's the very nature of faith, though, right? Like, that's the Kierkegaardian project too. It is to essentially say, like, no, it's the very contradiction that's the beauty of faith, not this sort of desire to find some sort of bridge, because like the only bridge that exists is like the literal body of Christ. Like, he is the only thing that bridges that gap, and the faith is that, like, that's the role of faith, is to take that leap.
Well, and there seems to be, a performativity kind of thesis underlying some of what Althusser is saying as well, or at least in the way that, Judith Butler, for instance, will later take it up. She cites the interpolation thesis as one of the examples she gives in Bodies That Matter. And Althusser does speak about it in relation to birthing and gendering as well. The discovery that individuals are always already subjects, and that individuality is abstract with respect to subjectivity. So he's creating a separation here between kind of inner monologue, say, discursive consciousness and subjectivity. Holy Communion is also a kind of birth, a kind of induction into the social fabric of a community. So you can see how the function of ISAs here is to enmesh or create that kind of fabric, much like the social construction of binary gender. And you can also, I think in Althusser how this reciprocal action goes both ways. And his rebuttal to somebody like Judith Butler, say, and this is where you might get the Žižekian line, is that you have to look at class dynamics, and that class difference is kind of the ultimate contradiction in the social formation that we inhabit. I don't know if I would push it that far, and I don't know if later Althusser would, but that's how it stands in On Ideology.
Maybe a good way to kind of finalize everything is to ask, does Althusser then have a positive political program? I mean, I know the answer that's coming here in terms of how do we create a kind of rupture that allows us to overcome this host of contradictions that we embody, or maybe to use Deleuzian terms, to escape the Oedipal snare. What does he propose?
The refrain that you would hear in Althusser oftentimes is that philosophy is class struggle in the field of theory. And I think that translates into a political project, as we enter into a society that is more and more dominated by expertise, competencies, know-hows, discursive representational formations. It requires this kind of ontologically rooted and scientific strategy, if I can gloss on Althusser, towards thinking creative exits from this kind of ideological totality that can appear to have no outsides. It does have breaking points and ruptures, and this is in some ways Althusser's call for philosophy, for a kind of militant philosophy. He was always somebody who found class struggle necessary, and on the fringes of the institutions that he was a part of, at the École Normale, in the PCF, the French Communist Party. He remained a member of the party long after French intellectuals thought it was no longer in vogue and due to the disastrous polities of the Third International. But, it was to occupy the kind of social dynamics of the class struggle in a way that he could wage philosophical, theoretical class war. And I think that is his advice for today.
Wow, Anthony really knows his stuff. In fact, I'm going to be on their podcast tomorrow, Out of Left Field. We're going to be talking about our experience teaching in prisons. In fact, I imagine based on the questions he sent me, I'm probably going to go into more depth about what I have done on that program than I did on my own program. I just wanted to take another moment to thank all of the new patrons that we have. I think we're up to about 30 or something like that. If you want to become a patron, spend $1, $5, $10 a month supporting us, please hop on over. Here's a secret. There's some discounts to our merch store that you can only access through the Patreon account. Also, it is there that you can communicate suggestions to us about what kind of topics that you want to see on the show, or give us any other feedback that you have. And as I've suggested, one of the ways that you can support us is actually purchase some of the merch that we have been creating. We have been creating critical theory t-shirts and hoodies. You can find that on our Twitter page if you navigate over there. They're pretty cool. I'm the designer. I think a lot of people like the Delusionghattari Foucault mashup that I did, so go ahead and check that out too. In upcoming episodes, we're going to talk with Shelley Tremaine and disability studies, and also, as promised, we're going to do that show on left Nietzscheanism. Please, everybody, stay safe out there, and we will catch you next time we release an episode. Thanks again.